Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop, and in this video I'm talking all about Crusade Armageddon, specifically going through the campaign system that ties in with the Crusade rules. If you haven't seen part 2 of this video, I do suggest checking it out, where I cover all of the Crusade core rules, and some elements that I reference in that video I have not included in this video. So for a complete experience, make sure you check out that one first. That's all for now, so let's get on with the video. In this part of the episode, I'm going through Crusade Armageddon through the Armageddon campaign rules. If you're listening along, we've already talked about all the lore from Armageddon and also covered all the Crusade core rules, but what ties into those core rules is the specific Armageddon campaign. So we're going to get into that now. And as I've mentioned previously, there are 4 different campaign books, and each one has different Crusade rules. So you are spoiled for choice in terms of theme and flavor. This one is all about the planet Armageddon, the forces of chaos versus the Imperium trying to hold on to that planet and purge the planet of chaos. And it's a warp-tainted land. Angron is there doing many violent things, and demons are spilling out through the warp. So we're likely to see a lot of those narrative elements sprinkled into this campaign system. So with that all said and done, let's now get on and have a look at the actual campaign rules itself. So the first page is just giving us an introduction into what's covered in the campaign, and it's probably worth talking about this just at the very beginning so you can get a sense about what is covered within this campaign. So we start off with the Armageddon campaign and how it fits in and alongside the other campaign books. We've got Crusade badges as well, which are badges of honor that your units can gain for taking part in the Armageddon campaign. You've got battle traits, which we talked about in the last section, which are bonuses that your units can get when they level up. We've got mighty champions, which are special, unique abilities gifted to epic heroes. We've got Crusade relics, which is something similar to battle traits, upgrades that characters can take when they level up. We've then got the Armageddon Crusade battles, which talks about the flow of the setting up of a game, playing the game, and the post-game sequence, similar to what you would find in the fold-out of your chapter-approved booklet that comes with the deck of cards. And then you've got hellscapes, which are your unique settings to be fighting in. Anomalies are a spin-off of this, which basically give you some warp-infused flavor that occurs on a turn-by-turn basis. You've got unbound adversaries, which are enemies that will be on the tabletop. These are themed to demons, and they will be pitched against both you and your opponent. So neither of you get to control them, and they are something for you to both deal with. Then you've got Crusade blessings, which is a balancing mechanic. You've got agendas, which are effectively your secondaries that you can do within your missions. And then you've got, lastly, the Crusade missions themselves, and there is a lot of them. So on the Armageddon campaign page, it just gives you a very brief overview of what the campaign entails, but we're going to get into the weeds of that when we go through the other pages. But it also briefly here talks about the Crusade badges, which are things that your units get. And weirdly, it talks about the Crusade badges here, but then details them later on. So effectively, after every battle, every unit gains a campaign badge. But that's not quite the case, because actually every badge has a stipulation on it in terms of the requirements that need to be met to gain that campaign badge. But effectively, once you've unlocked that badge, that unit gains that badge, and it keeps it forevermore, even if you were then playing other campaigns. So, for example, if you play through the Armageddon campaign with your Crusade army, but then after you finish this campaign, you go on to fight in the Nakman Gauntlet campaign, your army will still carry those badges of honor, the campaign badges, into that campaign as well. And it says that some battle honors are tied to specific Crusade badges. I've yet to see that myself, but apparently, according to the book, those do exist. So the first thing you need to do for the Armageddon campaign, and with any of the other Crusade books, you need to select a campaign master. Now, in an ideal world, this would be someone not playing in the Crusade, so they are fair and impartial when it comes to being an arbiter for some judgment calls. but they do say you can be a player as well. But at the end of the day, this is really just someone collating all the game records for wins and the losses, who played who, and logging that down and keeping track and making sure everyone is on pace to completing their games in each phase of the campaign. You then need to form some alliances. There are 3 alliances to pick in total. It does say you can have a minimum of 2 players, so at the very least you need 2 alliances. The first 2 that are given here should be the main 2, and then the last one is a bonus one. So the first one is Gatebreakers. This is themed to be the Imperial forces. These are the people on Armageddon that are trying to destroy the Red Angel's Gate. And if for some reason you've got to this part of the episode and you don't know what I'm talking about, I suggest you go check out the section where I go through the lore of the Armageddon book in detail. Next up, you've got the Desecrators, which are clearly the Chaos-themed group. These are the people trying to vie for control and ultimately destroy the Gatebreakers and stop the gate from being closed. And then lastly, you've got the Marauders, which is the catch-all bucket for anything that doesn't really fit into the first 2. Thematically, this would be the Orcs on Armageddon because they live in the equatorial jungle and just making themselves a nuisance. But equally, it would fit any kind of piratical Xenos force that doesn't really fit into the other 2 categories. They also say if you predominantly end up having majority of Imperial players, because you often always see gaming groups that are just filled with Space Marine players. So if that's the case, you unfortunately will need to divvy up your sides. Maybe some of those Space Marine players will play as turncoats for this campaign and fight for the forces of chaos. Alternatively, you could always theme it slightly different. Maybe you've just got some differences in terms of how your gene seed is collected, a la Lofturum Blackheart. So with your 2 to 3 teams formed, you can then go about setting your campaign length. The campaign itself is formed into 4 main phases, but each phase can be varying in length depending on how many games you want to play. So they recommend that you play 1 game per phase, and they kind of suggest that you also play 1 game per week. So in theory, if you wanted a very fast campaign, you can just play 1 game per week, and actually you'll then be finished in a month. But you can also have a very slow game where you try and play 4 games over each act, 1 per week. So each phase of the campaign will be 1 month, so therefore 4 months in total. It's totally up to you, and you don't really need to try and keep a fixed amount. At the very least, even if each player isn't necessarily getting a game in each phase, in an ideal world, you want each alliance to have the same amount of games spread across them, because you might have some players that are very consistent and able to play games on a regular basis, and others that are just dipping in and out. So that is something to consider. Each alliance also has a narrative goal, and there will be 1 narrative goal for each of the 4 campaign phases. And depending on whether you will succeed in that narrative goal, you will go down a different path to your next narrative goal. So when it comes to ending the campaign, the alliance with the most strategic points wins. So that's your key thing to be collecting as a player. However, if it's tied, it's then down to the most campaign points. So that's the second most important thing. And then if you have 2 alliances where both the strategic points and the campaign points are tied, it's then considered a draw, and the battle for Armageddon is considered to carry on. How do you go about winning campaign points? Well, at the end of each phase, the alliance with the most strategic points is considered the winner of that phase, and they win 1 campaign point. Strategic points are then reset to 0, so you're not ever going to have a runaway winner from one team accumulating lots of strategic points early doors, so there's everything to play for down in the very last phase. However, obviously, being consistent and doing well and getting the campaign points will help you when it comes to those tiebreakers. So across the next 3 pages, we've got our narrative goals, 1 page for each alliance. So I'm going to show you here the Gatebreakers, which is obviously Team Imperium in this example. So if you're watching it along on video, you can see that there are 4 columns, and each column represents 1 of those campaign phases. So you will start off on the left-hand side at your first narrative goal, of which there's only 1. So you start off there. In the next 2 columns for phases 2 and 3, there are 2 different narrative goals, and which one you do depends on whether you succeed or fail in your preceding narrative goal. And in the last column, which is phase 4, there's only one narrative goal. So regardless if you succeeded or failed in your prior narrative goal, you will be doing the same end goal in phase 4. You might also notice that they're all numbered 1 to 6, which is a little bit odd because actually, yes, there's technically 6 different narrative goals, but you're only ever going to be able to do 4 of them because 2 of them will just be excluded to you because you're doing an either or option. You're not able to do both. And note, these are narrative goals for your alliance as a whole. It's not you as an individual. So let's look at the first one that you start off by doing in phase 1 of the campaign for the Gatebreakers. So it's called Stabilizing the Front. At the end of each battle, if you are the victor, gain 5 strategic points. Now it's worth noting that that benefit is the same benefit for both the other 2 alliances for their phase 1 narrative goal. You then have 2 different outcomes. So you then have Resurgent Morale, which is if you succeed in your narrative goal in phase 1. In the next campaign phase, attempt to reclaim the Lost Hives narrative goal. And each time you purchase the increased supply limit requisition, increase your Crusade Force supply by 250 points instead of 200. And then lastly, there's Grim Determination, which is if you fail your narrative goal. In the next campaign phase, attempt to strengthen the Imperator line narrative goal, and in each battle, the first time a unit from your Crusade army fails a Battle Shock test, that unit instead passes that test. So you'll notice that even though you failed your narrative goal, you're still getting a bonus, you're not being penalized, which is actually really good because if you're losing, you're not going to spiral down and lose more, and the people winning aren't getting better bonuses and able to win much easier in the next campaign phase. But what instead you're getting is just different narrative stories taking you on a journey based on whether you win or lose, which I really like. In the second column, which is the phase 2 of the campaign, there are those 2 narrative goals that they've just talked about. If you are succeeding, you basically take the top one, and if you are losing, you are taking the bottom one. And that follows on for phase 3. And as I've already mentioned, when you go on to phase 4, you're doing the same one regardless of whether you win or lose. So as phase 4 doesn't really have a narrative goal that you need to complete because this is ultimately deciding the victor of the campaign, instead it's just giving you a outright bonus. This one for the Gatebreakers is Shatter the Red Angel's Gate. At the start of the first battle round, you gain a number of command points equal to the number of campaign points that your alliance has. And at the end of each battle, if you're the victor, you gain 5 strategic points. And similar to the first narrative goal, these bonuses are the exact same ones for the other 2 alliances as well. So I can quickly show you the other 2 pages if you're watching along. You've got the Desecrators, again, same sort of layout. It's just thematically very different. And then there's also the Marauders one as well. So we've then got the Crusade badges. Each alliance has its own set of 3 Crusade badges, and each one is progressively more difficult to achieve. Now, it's not mentioned here, slightly oddly, but it's mentioned at the beginning of the campaign rules that effectively every unit in your army that took part in a battle gains a campaign badge. However, there's 2 stipulations on each campaign badge, which, as far as I'm aware, you have to meet to gain that campaign badge, and each one gets progressively more difficult. So if we look at the Gatebreakers, 3 badges. The first one is Liberators of Theradis, and to gain this one, you need to have at least 10 strategic points or completed 1 narrative goal. For the second one, it's Saviors of the Northern Hive, and for this one, you need 20 strategic points or completed 2 narrative goals. And the final one is Breakers of the Angel's Gate, where you need to have gained 30 strategic points or completed 3 narrative goals. Noting that in total, there are only 4 narrative goals that you can actually complete. So actually trying to get 3 is actually quite difficult. Now, these are bullet pointed, so I assume you don't need to do both of them, i.e. you don't need both 10 strategic points and to complete 1 narrative goal, and instead you need just 1 of them, because actually I think trying to achieve both would be quite difficult, but nowhere in the rules that actually seem to qualify which of those it is, whether it's both or just 1. So personally, I would just say it's 1, but potentially maybe you want to discuss that with your campaign master or collectively as a campaign group and decide which one you want to do. And as I've mentioned before, these will apply to units that took part in a battle that have successfully met those requirements, and they will stay with that unit forevermore, even if they then go on to other campaigns. So it's a nice little record of their achievement if you're going to play multiple Crusade campaigns. So these battle traits are something I've already covered in the Crusade core rules, because the Crusade core rules don't really work without these. So I showed them off there. So I'm not really going to talk about them in detail, but just know that these are bonuses that units can get once they go up a rank and effectively have accumulated enough XP to level up. There's a bunch of different ones depending on what type of unit there are. So in these examples, you've got infantry units, monsters and vehicles, mounted, beasts, and psychers. You've then got mighty champions. Basically, every time you add an epic hero to your Crusade force, you have to alert your campaign master, and they will assign that epic hero one of these mighty champion abilities. This is just extra narrative flavoring to tie them into the Armageddon setting. Now, if you want to historically recreate the battle for Armageddon, they give you some examples if you want to take High Marshal Helbrecht, Chaplain Grimaldus, and Angron. So they give you some guidance on what to take there. So there's one extra little caveat around the rules that it's worth noting, that if you happen to have a unit that contains multiple epic heroes, because it contains several characters, only one of those epic heroes actually gains the benefit, not all of them. So the campaign master gets to pick which one it goes to. So let's quickly look at Frontline Champions, which is the first one of the 7 that they've given us here. At the declare battle formation step, select one of the following. While this model is leading a unit, weapons equipped by models in this unit have the anti-unbound adversaries 4+ ability. Noting that the unbound adversaries are these non-player controlled units that appear on the battlefield that both you and your opponent have to deal with, effectively AI controlled roaming demons. So this would allow you to wound them on a 4+. You then also select one Armageddon battle trait. This must be a battle trait they could have if they were not an epic hero, and until the end of that battle, this epic hero model and the unit they join have this battle trait. So you gain an extra battle trait as well, which is pretty good, and some of those are quite tasty. And specifically, it says you get to choose it as well, so that could be very strong. So we then move on to Crusade relics, and much like battle traits, I've actually already covered them in the Crusade core rule section, but these are equipment that heroes can gain when they level up. Instead of selecting a battle trait, they can take a Crusade relic as well, which is a very powerful ability that they can gain. There's 3 levels, and they're all kind of locked to the different levels of rank that your heroes can gain as they go up in XP value. Then we've got the order of playing the game in the Armageddon Crusades battles page. This is very similar to what you would get in both the core rulebook and also in your fold-out booklet in your chapter-approved deck of cards. Now, it's a bit repetitive, I'll go through it, but I'll point out the differences between this and a standard game of 40k. Like normal, you start off by selecting your battle size. Obviously, the battle size will be limited by the number of supply points that both you and your opponent have, because that really dictates the number of points eligible for you to fight in a battle. You then muster your Crusade army, which is just have an army ready to fight, have a list, and you can give that to your opponent. Then you get to determine your mission. One option is just to select the most thematically appropriate, of which there are 16 missions in total, or alternatively, you can randomize it. If you're going to randomize it, you first roll 1d6 on a roll of 1 to 3. You're then rolling off in the first of the 2 available tables to you to determine the actual mission, and if you roll a 4 to 6, you're rolling off on the second table. So the first table is symmetrical missions, while the second table is asymmetrical missions, so you're going to have a much more sort of narrative attacker-defender style of mission. One interesting thing to note when you're rolling on the mission table, you're rolling a d33, and effectively if you roll a double 3, which will be a 5 or a 6 on both dice, you roll on the other table rather than re-roll on this table. So even though you might have thought you were playing a symmetrical mission or an asymmetrical mission, you might find you end up playing the other type. So step 4, you then determine the attacker and defender. Step 5, you read the mission. Pretty straightforward. Step 6, place the objective markers. Step 7, create the battlefield. Noting you want this to be thematically appropriate, potentially based around the hellscape that your mission will take part in, and your mission will lay out which of those hellscapes you'll be playing on. Then step 8 is purchase your requisitions, which are meant to do just before a battle, which seems like crazy nonsense, because this fundamentally changes your army composition. So by all means, decide amongst yourselves and strong arm the campaign master to say you just do this at the end of your missions instead of the start of a mission, because this is a woefully inappropriate place to be doing a whole lot of paperwork just before you want to start rolling some dice. Number 9 is select your agendas, which we'll talk about briefly, but these are effectively your secondary missions, much like you would be doing in chapter approved. Then number 10, you select your Crusade blessings, which we'll also cover in more detail. This is a balancing mechanic if two armies are going up against each other and one is much more experienced than the other. Step 11 is declare your battle formations, so determine which leader units are attached to which units, what goes in transports and which are going to be deep striking or in reserve. Then step 12, you deploy your Crusade armies, and if you're playing in a mission which uses the unbound adversaries, they're also deployed at this stage as well. Next, you get to redeploy any units. Then you get to determine who gets the first turn. Then step 15 is resolve any pre-battle rules. Step 16 is set the warp events, which we will talk about in more detail. Most missions will determine the scale and intensity of the warp events, but if they don't, you roll off at this point to determine what they're going to be. Step 17 is begin the battle, and then everything else is a post-game sequence. So you step 18, end the battle, 19, determine the victor, 20, update the Crusade cards, and 21, update the order of battle. Noting realistically somewhere between 20 and 21, you should also be spending your RP to spend your requisition points, because this is a much better time and place to be doing it rather than just at the beginning of a mission. So next up is Hellscapes, but weirdly as part of Hellscapes they talk about actions, because actions aren't part of the core rules in 10th edition, which is much to the chagrin of literally everyone. That seemed like a bit of a mistake. However, the actions here are very similar to those in chapter approved. We then have warp counters. So warp counters are used basically in the anomalies and hellscapes, and they are a way of keeping track with how warp infused your units are. So you do need some form of counters to add to your models. The rules just state here that once a unit gains a warp counter, it stays with it for the rest of the battle until a rule tells you to remove it. Now, you could just use dice as warp counters. You'd obviously have to make sure they're a different color from any that you're using to track wounds on. But this is a great example of doing some narrative flavoring and hobby, and actually you could create your own warp counters. Now, potentially you could use something like Brimstone Horrors as tiny little warp counters. I think that would be quite appropriate, or something like the green Skaven Warpstone from Age of Sigmar, and having them on a nice small base would also look really good. Essentially, you could just have a base with a load of Blood for the Blood God technical paint all over it to symbolize the corn-infused warp that we've got on the planet of Armageddon. So a few good excuses for hobby, and you can get your old brain cells thinking about how you can create your own. Then we've got a bit about using the hellscape. So there are three main sections. One, you've got your main rule for that particular hellscape. You've then got a particular action that hellscape might allow you to do, which is why they've given us the action rule. And then lastly, you've got your empiric anomaly, which is a special version of warp anomaly that might happen when you're rolling on the warp anomalies table. And when you hit that special anomaly, you will consult the hellscape rules for that particular empiric anomaly. There's then some guidance on if you just want to add hellscapes to other missions, which you might want to do, because while there are 16 missions here, you might want to use your own or use more generic missions as well. So you just roll 1d6 and that determines which of the two tables you use. And then you roll another d6 to determine your hellscape. And on a roll of 1 to 4, there'd be a particular hellscape. And on a roll of 5 to 6, you will just re-roll again. So for the hellscapes themselves, there are 4 pages in total, 2 double pages. They are gorgeously laid out with like a kind of heretical icon at the top and what looks like a tattered banner going down with all the text for that hellscape. So I'm going to pick one here and we're going to talk about faded reality. So the first rule is fading, which is from the second battle round onwards, at the end of your opponent's turn or at the end of a battle, whichever happens first, roll 1d6 for each unit in your Crusade army not wholly within your deployment zone. On a 4+, give that unit 1 warp counter. Then for each unit from your Crusade army that has 2 or more warp counters, remove it from the battlefield. It is destroyed, but they don't take an out of action test, which is the way you get battle scars. If this unit is in a transport and there are 1 or more units embarked within that transport, those embarked units are also destroyed, but also do not take out of action tests. So that is extremely powerful and dangerous. And you're going to be really encouraged to stay in your deployment zone. But sadly, to fight the missions, I can imagine you're going to be going outside of your deployment zone, because getting 2 warp counters means you're out of the game. So from the third battle round onwards, you've got quite a high chance that a lot of your units will be disappearing from the table, unless you do the following thing. So this Hellscape also gives us the force of will action, which, as all actions do, you do it in your shooting phase, and you select 1 unit from your Crusade army. It completes at the end of your turn, and if it does complete, you remove all warp counters from that unit. So you do have a way of mitigating gaining those warp counters at the sacrifice of not really being able to do anything that turn. Obviously, you could fight if you're within combat, but you can't shoot and you can't charge. So this is quite punishing. And then there's the Empiric Anomaly, which is the special warp anomaly that you might get when you roll on the anomalies table, which we'll get onto next. And this is the Empiric Anomaly. So starting with the player who has the first turn, each player selects 1 unit from the battlefield, noting it doesn't have to be yours, and then roll a d6. On a 1 to 3, give that unit 1 warp counter. On a 4+, if that unit has 1 or more warp counters, remove 1 counter from that unit. So it could be positive, it could be negative. It's literally down to a 50-50 dice roll. So it's up to you to either play risky and try putting it on one of yours, hoping that it can remove a counter. Maybe you go for a big play and try and put it on one of your opponent's models, hoping it will give them a second counter and knock that unit out of the game. Or you could play it safe and put it on an enemy unit that has 0 warp counters on it and hope it gains 1. And if you roll a 4+, nothing happens. And then on the second page of Hellscapes, let's talk about Endless Nightmare, which is the last one. So the rule for this one is no respite. Until the start of the 4th battle round, each time a unit with no warp counters is destroyed, excluding character units, that unit's player rolls a d6. If the result is greater than the current battle round number, that player places that unit into strategic reserve at its starting strength with all its lost wounds regained, although any one-shot weapons equipped by models in that unit that were shot before they were destroyed still count as having been shot. But you do give that unit 1 warp counter, noting that on the missions that these are going to be on, the warp counters mean something different from the last Hellscape. So this one's quite cool. Rather than being punishing, you've just got a way of bringing back your dead models and keeping them alive for a bit longer. But they do go back into strategic reserve. So they are going to be off the table. And depending on if they can deep strike or not, they might struggle getting back on the board in an interesting spot. So if Hellscapes weren't enough complicated rules for your missions, you've also got the anomalies. These are warp anomalies. Now you have on the left-hand side a beautiful representation of these warp anomalies. Effectively, it's a strength and scale chart. They are concentric circles, circles within circles. And the circles are split up into thirds, and each third represents a different intensity. So for intensities, you've got minor, major, and catastrophic. And these basically determine when the warp anomalies actually start happening in the mission. For the minor anomalies, it's just at the start of every battle round. And then for the major, it's at the start of every player turn. So effectively happening twice per battle round. Then you have your 3 concentric circles, which is your intensity scale, starting from the smallest circle on the inside, working your way out from the lowest to the highest intensity. And this determines the number of times you will roll on the anomalies table each time one of these anomalies is triggered. So for example, in the minor section of anomalies, you are always, regardless of intensity, just rolling for 1 warp anomaly. And for the major and catastrophic warp anomalies, you are rolling for 1, 2, or 3 warp anomalies depending on the intensity. Now, most missions will tell you what the scale and intensity is, but there's a few little rules that talk about generating your own, either if the mission doesn't tell you, or if you want to apply this to any other mission that you might find in any of the other books, or even if you want to make your own custom missions. So to do that, you simply roll 2d3, assigning one of the d3s to the scale and one to the intensity. As we've already talked about, the scale determines at what point in the mission do these anomalies occur. When that thing is triggered, whether it's the start of a particular battle round or the start of a player's turn, you will roll 3d6 on the anomalies table, which will generate you one of the myriad warp anomalies. So the bottommost result from 3d6 will be a 3, so that will give you demonic assault. For each unit on the battlefield that has one or more warp counters, that unit suffers d6 mortal wounds for each warp counter it has. So if you've got multiple warp counters, this can be exceedingly punishing, but noting that you would need to roll 3 ones on a d6. So depending on how good your luck is or how terrible it is, this in theory should be a rare occurrence. Now, if you happen to roll a 10, this is your special empiric anomaly. This is the empiric anomaly given on the hellscapes. So depending on which mission you are, you'll be given a hellscape, and depending on which hellscape you're on, you will have a different empiric ability. So this means no matter how many times you're rolling on this table, you've always got a chance of something quite unique happening on each and every mission. So number 11 is Warp Surge Anomaly. This is another special one. Now, every single mission should have a unique Warp Surge Anomaly rule associated with it. So you will go back to your mission and look up the rule there and determine what it is. And if it isn't, you will do this generic one instead, which is starting with the attacker. Each player selects one unit and gives that unit one warp counter. And then for the very top end of the anomalies table, if you roll 3 6s, you're going to end up with reality blinks. So for each unit on the battlefield that has one or more warp counters, roll 1d6 for each warp counter that unit has. The result is the number of wounds that unit regains. One at a time, you can do the following. If the unit contains one or more models with fewer than their starting number of wounds remaining, select one of those models and it regains 1 lost wound. If all models in that unit have their starting number of wounds, but the unit is not at full strength, 1 destroyed model is returned to that unit with 1 wound remaining. And lastly, if all the models in that unit have the starting number of wounds and the unit is at starting strength, it does not gain any more wounds. So you will follow this, effectively regaining either wounds or a model with 1 wound, and then potentially that one model regaining its wounds back until it's at full strength, and then repeating that process. So again, if you're going to roll 3 ones, it's going to be extremely punishing, but if you can roll 3 6s, it's going to be pretty good for you, but also good for your opponent as well. Unbound adversaries. So these are meant to be representing the Khornate demons under Angron's control, roaming mercilessly, spilling out from the warp, attacking everyone in sight. Now, there's a few things here which make this quite interesting. One is very thematic and flavoursome, probably less so if you're playing the Chaos Alliance and finding yourself attacked by your own Khornate demons, especially when you're World Eaters and you have Angron, but your own demons seem to be attacking you. So this is a slight odd narrative dissonance that is happening with the game rules and what should really be happening, but it would also be really unfair if the Chaos player got to actually control these. So the idea that they're just spilling out of the warp and attacking everyone, Khorne obviously doesn't care where the blood flows, so maybe there is a nugget of lore which you can use to justify that they're just going to mercilessly attack everyone, Khorne included. The other issue is you do need some demon models to represent these on the tabletop. They do give you some examples of what you can use, but if you don't happen to have some Khorne demons, or any demons for that matter, you might really struggle. Yes, I guess you could use something like Genestealer cults to represent a cult uprising on your planet, fighting all the other players. But that doesn't really work if you're trying to play a game set on Armageddon. So you could narratively twist the setting to try and make it work with whatever collection people have. Hopefully, though, if you're playing in a large enough gaming group, there will be someone with some demons, whether they're Khorne demons, maybe you've got some Nurgle or Slanesh or Tzeentch demons instead that you could use those. And lastly, you could just take these rules out if you don't have any suitable miniatures whatsoever. They do say the missions are designed with the unbound adversaries in mind, so ideally you should be keeping them in. And again, it's kind of cool flavor sauce for your missions, so ideally you should be playing with them, but it does require you to have some suitable models that you can use. What models can you use? So there are 4 types of demons that they're giving you. There are lesser demons, which are infantry models on a 30mm round base. The suggestion here is bloodletters. Next up is the abomination category. This is for infantry and beast models on 50mm round bases, and they recommend chaos spawn. Then you've got demonic beasts, which are mounted or beast models on 75 or 90mm oval bases. The suggestion here is blood crushers. And then lastly, we've got a greater demon, monster or walker model on 100mm round base, 120mm oval base, or 130mm round base. And their example is a bloodthirster. The fact that they're giving you a walker keyword implies maybe that they're expecting you to just use whatever you have to hand, and that might not be a chaos army whatsoever. Trying to make it fit the theming of marauding demons might be a bit difficult, but maybe instead these are marauding pirates, Xenos raiders from space. That might work all the much more better, or potentially an angry inquisitor with a mob of space marines or Astra Militarum or whoever he might possibly have under his control. So I think with a little bit of tweaking of the words, you could make this work. Though for this particular campaign, the theming of demons is most appropriate, so trying to find something closest to that would be best. So the demons are broken down into power level from 1 to 3, 1 being the weakest and 3 being the highest, and there is a little bit of cross-pollination between the two. Each mission that uses the unbound adversaries will tell you what power level you're using and how many you need to deploy. So you consult the power level and then you will roll a d6. So effectively, on a 1 to 3, you get 1 set of demons, and a 4 to 6, you will get another set of demons. So for example, power level 1, on a roll of 1 to 3, you will get 10 lesser demons, and a 4 to 6, you will get 2 abominations. Then the abominations will appear on the lower half of power level 2, and whatever's on the higher level of power level 2 will appear at the lower level of power level 3, and the top level of power level 3 is, no surprises, a greater demon. There's also rules for random adversaries, which I think is pretty much if you just want to add them in if you're playing a mission that doesn't have them, similar to the hellscapes or warp anomalies. So a great way to just roll some dice and see what you end up having, rather than one of those fixed missions that's going to contain it. Then there's a few specific rules with how you use the unbound adversaries on the tabletop. So for example, they never take battle shock tests, leadership tests, they can't perform actions, and they never gain warp counters. And there's a bit about level of control, which is effectively giving them an objective control score, but they can't ever hold objectives, but they still deny objectives. So if your unit is on an objective that has unbound adversaries on, you will still need to beat their control score to take the objective. Otherwise, it will be contested. Then we've got the unbound adversary's turn. Now, this happens at the start of every battle round. It's its own self-contained turn with its mini AI features in it. That's all pretty straightforward. So the movement phase, you move a unit towards the closest enemy unit. Both yours and your opponent's are viable here. In the shooting phase, you shoot at the closest enemy unit. In the charge phase, unsurprisingly, you're charging the closest enemy unit. And in the fight phase, only the unbound adversaries fight. Whoever they're in combat with don't fight. And when it's your and your opponent's turn, the unbound adversaries don't fight in the fight phase. Otherwise, it gets horrendously messy with multiple fight phases each battle round, which is something that happened in the 9th edition multiplayer rules. It's worth noting that if the unbound adversaries are in combat with a unit from your army and your opponent's, they're both going to be equally close to each other, and that is where a key rule comes in. So if at any point, whether it comes to moving, shooting, charging, and in the fight phase, 2 different units are equidistant from each other, it's the player with the most warp counters across their whole army that gets to break the tie and decide where those unbound adversaries go. And as I pointed out, that is going to be key for combats where there are multiple units between yourself, your opponent, and the unbound adversaries, because that's when you're going to be base to base, and distances are going to be exactly the same. Less likely to happen in other phases, but it still might happen. So it's good that they've included that there to cover those niche examples. And then they've given us the 4 data sheets for the greater demon, the lesser demon, the abomination, and the demonic beasts. They're very pared back. There's only 1 weapon profile. There are no special abilities. Now, I did check in the Warhammer app against their corresponding recommended units, such as things like the Chaos Spawn and the Blood Crushers. And while these do have similar profiles, they're not exactly the same. So they are different from the actual models that they're meant to be representing. So that's worth bearing in mind. If you own those rules, don't get confused. They're not exactly the same. And likewise, if you did have different models, you can still use these rules to represent them. Now we get on to Crusade Blessings. So this is the difference in experience between the 2 different armies, which is really good if you've got maybe a new player starting Crusade and someone else has been playing with their Crusade army for a much longer period of time. As I mentioned in the Crusade core rules section, every time a unit goes up a rank, it will gain a battle honor, and in doing so, it will also gain a Crusade point. So you will total up all your Crusade points and work out the difference between yours and your opponent's army. If you are 0 to 4 Crusade point difference, so quite minor, there will be 0 Crusade blessings. If it's 5 to 9 Crusade point difference, it will be 1 Crusade blessing. If it's 10 to 19 point difference, it will be 2 Crusade blessings. And if it's 20 plus, regardless of how high, it's only 4 Crusade blessings. So that is the cap that you max out at, but you get these abilities for free to try and help balance out the difference in the power scale between the 2 armies. So there are 10 different Crusade blessings plus an additional 3. Those 3 are unique to each individual alliance. So there's 1 for Imperium, 1 for Chaos, and 1 for that marauding Xenos alliance. So let's take a look at a few of them. There's Grand Strategist, which is you start the battle with 2 CP, so a nice simple one. Then there's Stygian Darkness. So until the start of the second battle round, each unit from your Crusade army has the stealth ability. So quite strong, but only lasts for the first battle round, which depending on your terrain layouts, might not be all that useful. Then let's look at one of the Alliance specific blessings. So there's Slaves to Darkness, which is fittingly for the Chaos one. So in the Unbound Adversaries turn, you can select 1 Unbound Adversaries unit on the battlefield, and until the end of that turn, the unit treats the units in your Crusade army as friendly units. So effectively, you're getting to take control of one of those units for the turn, because it will just go towards the closest enemy unit and not yours. You don't necessarily get to dictate exactly where they're going and who they're fighting. It's just going to be the closest one. But depending on when you use it, that could be really key in a clutch moment to help you out. And then we get on to agendas. So agendas are much like the secondary objectives that you get to pick at the start of a battle for your normal match play chapter approved missions. However, rather than help you win the battle, these instead help you level up your units, predominantly by completing a secondary to get some XP, and from most of the fixed options, you gain a strategic point, which will help you win your narrative goal for your alliance, whereas there's also tactical agendas, which are just specifically XP only for your units. So at the start of a mission, you get to select 2 agendas. These could be 2 fixed ones or 1 fixed one and 1 tactical. The tactical ones you will generate each turn, but let's first of all look at some of the fixed options. So the first one is Assassinate. Each time a model from your Crusade army destroys an enemy character unit, that model's unit gains 2 XP. Each time a model from your Crusade army destroys an enemy warlord, epic hero, or unbound adversary's character unit, that model's unit gains an additional XP. Then at the end of a battle, if the enemy's warlord is destroyed, you gain 1 strategic point. And there are 4 more fixed agendas that you can pick from. Only one of them has an action in, so that's worth bearing in mind. But if you decide to pick the tactical agendas, you will generate this in your command phase. Obviously, there's no deck of cards like there is in Chapter Approved, so instead you have some tables to roll on. So similar to the other mechanics in the campaign system, you'll roll 1d6 to determine which table you will then roll on. So a roll of 1 to 2 is table A, 3 to 4, table B, 5 to 6, table C. You'll then roll a further d6 and determine which of those tactical agendas on that table you now have to do. And then at the end of your turn, you will either have completed that tactical agenda and you'll be eligible to generate a new one in your next command phase. And if you haven't, you can decide to keep that tactical agenda and try and complete it next turn. Or you can choose to abandon that tactical agenda. You don't get anything for it, though, for abandoning it, unlike the secondaries in Chapter Approved. But also, at the beginning of your command phase, if you generate a tactical agenda that you don't like for 1 CP, you can generate a new one instead. So let's look at some of those tactical agendas. So on the first table, you've got Storm Sight, which is at the end of your turn, select 1 unit from your Crusade army that is within range of an objective marker that you control that was controlled by your opponent at the start of the turn. Your unit gains 2 XP. So steal an objective, gain 2 XP. Nice and simple. On the second table, there is Center Ground. At the start of your turn, select 1 unit from your Crusade army, excluding aircraft and battle-shocked units. That's wholly within 3 inches of the center of the battlefield. That unit gains 1 XP, or that unit gains 2 XP instead if there's no enemy units within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. And then on table C, we've got Deploy Explosives, which is an action that you can do. You do it in your shooting phase. 1 unit from your Crusade army that is either within 3 inches of the center of the battlefield or wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. It completes at the end of your turn, and the unit that performed the action gains 1 XP if it is within 3 inches of the center, or 2 XP if it's wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. Now we're on to the last section, which is all about the missions. Like I said before, there's 16 missions to choose from. Half of them are symmetrical and the other half are asymmetrical, so plenty of choices and plenty of narrative gaming tied in with the story from Armageddon. So like with many of the 40k missions, you've got your general mission rules, you've got your victory bonus, you've got your actual mission objectives that you need to complete the game, and then you've got your map showing you the deployment zones, where the objectives might be, and also you've got specifically the Unbound Adversaries deployment zone as well, which is where those marauding demons are going to appear. Then you've also got a little key just explaining those extra elements on those deployment zones. Under the mission rules, you can see that it lists the hellscapes. In the first mission that we've got under Total Domination, the hellscape is Folded Space. The warp event is Widespread and Major. And then you've got that Warp Surge anomaly, which you can get by rolling an 11 on your Warp Anomalies table, which is mission specific. And this is until the next time anomalies would be generated. Each time a unit that uses the Perilous Shortcut action, see page 94, after that unit is set up on the battlefield, it suffers D3 mortal wounds. The Perilous Shortcut action is a Hellscape-specific action that you can use, which allows you effectively to take a unit off the table and redeploy it down on the table, hence why it's a Perilous Shortcut. But in doing so, you're going to suffer some mortal wounds for using it. Now, quite often, missions might detail some kind of campaign bonus in terms of strategic points or something like that, but that's not given here because the missions are all based around those narrative goals. So that's already been covered earlier. However, what you do get is a victory bonus for your army. So if you won at the end of battle, you can select 1 unit that was wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, and that unit can gain 3 XP. So nothing too crazy, but just a nice way of helping you level up your army as you go on your crusade. So there are a bunch of different missions. As we said, there's some that are symmetrical, and then there are later ones which are asymmetrical, and there are some which deal with the end narrative of the Armageddon story. So, for example, the last one being Assault the Warp Gate. That's definitely one to save at the very end of the campaign. It's worth highlighting that at the very end of the book, there's a couple of fold-out pages. So we've got 2 pages showing you your order of battle, which is your main army card, and then we've got your Crusade cards, which are your individual cards for your units, so you can photocopy them. And then lastly, we've got the warp anomalies on one page, and then we've also got the hellscapes on the other, so a really handy reference when you're playing the game rather than having to look in the actual book itself. So that is quite useful. So that is the end of the Crusade Armageddon campaign system. It is really in-depth with a lot of extra detail and crunch to it. Do I think it's good? Sort of, yes. I think there's a lot of really interesting elements, but I also think there is potentially too much for most players to deal with. So not only do you have your normal Crusade rules, you've also got custom missions, you've got your hellscapes, you've got your warp anomalies, you've got your unbound adversaries. And unbound adversaries is something I've been talking about for a while. I've been saying that Games Workshop should be releasing little kill team size boxes of just one unit of a completely mad, maraudering Xenos race that you can then just build and paint up as its solo unit, and that will be your effectively unbound adversaries for your casual games of 40k, and they can be causing havoc on the tabletop for you and your opponent to deal with. So those elements are very cool, and it's great to see it here done specifically themed for demons, but I do feel like it might be a lot for players to deal with, especially if they're quite casual players that don't play a lot of 40k and struggle to learn their rules for just their army on its own. But if you are going all into the narrative of Armageddon, this is really solid. It pretty much covers everything that I could think that you could possibly want to recreate the games of Armageddon, with probably one exception, and that's the heroes of Armageddon. Yes, there are rules for mighty champions which apply to just epic heroes, but actually there's a lot of really cool named characters in the lore part of Armageddon. There's Colonel Kors from the Death Corps of Krieg. There's Grandmaster Morvans from the Grey Knights. There's Ascara, the Unbound, who's technically a firebrand cultist, but I would actually use her as a jackal to represent her based on the image and the weapons that she's described as using. These are all really cool characters, but they don't appear in this book whatsoever. The only way you could really represent them is just with your generic datasheet. What I would much rather see is that they either give you specific datasheets for those named characters, but only for using them in this campaign system. So they can't be used in match play elsewhere, unless, of course, you agree to do that with your friends. And effectively, all you're doing is you're taking those generic datasheets and tweaking them a little bit, which is sort of quite similar to how in Age of Sigmar at the moment we've got the Scourge of Garan system, where they are taking datasheets from units and characters, breathing them with fresh life and cool and interesting rules, and putting them out here using those existing models. And in Age of Sigmar, more than I can think of in 40k, you do sometimes have a generic model that is represented both with a unnamed character, just as a simple war scroll, generic general, but also a named character version of that war scroll as well. So effectively you could do that here, whether that's a commissar, your Krieg command squad, your jackal leader, or maybe a firebrand leader, even your grand master of your Grey Knights, or your captain for your Space Wolves. There's plenty of options. In theory, you could do this yourself by just tweaking those mighty hero rules. You just apply them to a character that is meant to represent one of those key players in the Armageddon story. Obviously, that's tweaking it slightly, but that would be a really handy way of doing it while still keeping it within the rules that they've presented with us. So I definitely think that is something worth looking into if you wanted to represent those characters. But overall, I really like how the campaign is laid out. I like that they've given you the options for the 3 different alliances, which is pretty much the staple that Games Workshop do now, which is Imperium, Chaos, and Xenos. And the narrative goals is a really interesting one, that it gives you something to do in each phase of the campaign without it forcing the winner to be decided too early on. It leaves it to the last act to determine who is the actual winner. Now, you could say that there's not enough accumulation of points, and that if someone's doing really well early on but then loses that last act, that actually that's a bit unfair. But otherwise, it's really easy to end up in a situation where you're going into the last phase of the campaign, but one alliance has already run ahead and clearly won it, regardless of how well they do in that last one. So potentially, maybe there is a better system where it's finely balanced, but effectively, they've used how well you perform in the rest of the acts as the tiebreaker, which could easily happen. So that's a good sort of balancing mechanic to reward you for doing well early on, and also trying to do well in the last act as well. So I think this is a campaign I'd be quite keen to do, but I don't actually have many friends that play Khorne Demons or Grey Knights, so I don't feel like I'd be doing it much narrative justice. But I do have my Krieg army, so I could narratively fill that void and represent Colonel Cause on the tabletop. Let me know what you think to these Crusade rules. If you like it, if you played it, if you enjoyed the campaign or hated it, please let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear from people that have actually played it, what they think of it. But I feel like I've gone on long enough talking about Crusade Armageddon, so we will move on to the next bit of the show. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, or you have any questions, please do let me know down in the comments below. Again, as always, if you'd like to support the show, please leave a thumbs up. That's greatly appreciated. You can also support me on Patreon. And if you'd like to get your hands on some custom conversion kits for your Warhammer models, you can head over to beyondthetabletop.com/shop, where I sell some custom kits of my own creation. That's it for the end of the Crusade Armageddon series. As I've already mentioned, these were taken from episode 233 of the Lookout Sir podcast, where I've cut them down into more manageable sections for consumption. If you have been enjoying this content, please do check out the Lookout Sir YouTube channel, where I am doing these long form video formats, and the content tends to appear a good few weeks earlier than it does over on this channel. That's all for now. Until next time, take care.